Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on us. Startle us once again with your word that we may be inspired, comforted, and unsettled by the stories that nurture our faith. Amen. If you have read Marilyn Robinson's book, Reading Genesis, or spent any time lately reflecting on the stories that were compiled into the first book of the Bible, you may have noticed a fine thread that runs through Genesis, which we might think of as the precariousness of life. Robinson addresses this underlying theme head-on as the thread, visible and unbroken, reveals in every chapter what moral philosophers call the ontological instability and insecurity that lie at the core of our experience of reality. From its very first pages, the book of Genesis makes a point to remind its readers that life is both sacred and tragic, beautiful and calamitous, breathtaking and heartbreaking, powerful and fragile, hopeful and unfair, sobering and unpredictable. We, along with the rest of creation, live in a universe where sometimes, maybe more often than we would like to admit, things we did not ask or prepare for, events beyond our will and not of our own making, moments not always totally bad and seldom purely good, happen without our consent and completely outside our control. Every living being clings precariously to the chance to live a full life within the atmospheric cocoon that allows the earth to sustain both our individual and collective strivings for existence. Our stories are composed, edited, refined, and finished, while our planet, hurtling elliptically around the sun within that margin of optimal balance, holds us within this reality filled with countless unbidden, unexpected, and unplanned events that raise a timeless theological question. Do we inhabit a universe that is indifferent to our hopes, deaf to our laughter, and unconcerned with our suffering? Or is there indeed, as Marilyn Robinson claims in her book, a God who is profoundly interested in human beings and invested in the well-being of creation as a whole? The redactors of Genesis were wrestling with this very weighty question when they began to gather the fragments of millennia-old tales of survival, resilience, hope, faith, and new beginnings in the face of senseless violence, catastrophe, and chaos. The ancient Israelites were living at the sunset of the Babylonian dominion and the rise of Persian rule in the 6th century before the Christian era. The people in exile and the ones left behind had witnessed the disintegration of the southern kingdom of Judah. God's covenant with Abraham appeared to have faded into a distant, dreamy past. The present was mostly defined by national trauma, forced dislocation, and what must have felt like meaningless suffering. The future seemed frightfully uncertain as people's trust in God began to be ground to dust by the apparent randomness of their circumstances. Many began to turn to a God of maybe. Maybe God would eventually listen to their tearful prayers. Maybe God would call another Moses and lead them on a new exodus. Maybe their God was just not powerful enough to pry them from the military grip of more sophisticated civilizations. Maybe there was no God at all, only the vast and empty universe the inescapable volatility of life, and the endless human effort to press purposelessness into meaning, uncertainty into stability, confusion into control, fragility into safety. Genesis and the Pentateuch as a whole arose as a religious response to this traumatized and fearful people whose immediate experience of the world denied any abstract theological belief in a good creator who works in, through, around, and beyond a very fickle human history, transmuting evil into good. Robinson lavishes praises on the genius of the editors who chose to piece together sacred stories that retained all the ambiguity, complexity, unfairness, as well as the goodness at the core of reality in Genesis. The ancient Israelites were invited to catch sight of the thread of life's precariousness, while at the same time seeing God's love and grace bending the great arc of history toward a resolution, a realization, a culmination too inconceivable to grasp in the very moment when life is unfolding. Author Christian Wyman once said, "Part of the mystery of grace is the way it operates not only as present joy and future hope, but also retroactively. In a way, the past is suffused with a presence that, at the time, you could only feel as the most implacable absence." This is, in essence, the theological language of Genesis that Marilyn Robinson amplifies in her book. The primeval stories of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, the Tower of Babel, the flood, Abraham and Sarah, Hagar and Ishmael, Esau and Jacob, Joseph and his brothers, were given to people who lived as we do, immersed in the immediacy of the now. They speak to those times when life feels unfair or meaningless, violent and hopeless, when the absence of divine presence seems stark and absolute. Yet, through these stories that span across generations and centuries, Genesis whispers an enduring truth at the heart of our faith. We are not abandoned to chance. God still longs to love us and the world into wholeness. The story of Joseph brings into sharper focus the early Israelites' belief that time itself moves toward God's purposes. On its surface, the story might look like a sequence of events marked by ups and downs, detours and delays, twists and turns, but weaving through even what looks like a senseless tragedy is the quiet persistence of God's unfailing love and grace. Joseph puts this deeply held theological conviction into words when he meets his brothers years later after being sold into slavery, now as the Egyptian governor, and says, "Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good in order to preserve a numerous people." Of course, it is unlikely that Joseph felt as assured of God's good intention for his life when his 10 brothers ganged up against him, tore off his robe, a sign of their father's favoritism for the youngest son, threw him in a dry pit in the midst of the desert, planned to kill him while they ate their lunch, changed their minds, and ended up selling him to the descendants of Ishmael, their cousins, for 20 pieces of silver. I imagine that in that moment of profound betrayal, powerlessness, fear, bewilderment, and despair, when he faced alone the precariousness of existence, Joseph wondered if God still cared about him at all. Down in the pit of hopelessness and anguish, I doubt very much that Joseph told that everything happens for a reason, or that God was somehow working out a grander purpose through his abuse and suffering. The hatred and cold-heartedness of his brothers must have left Joseph not just stunned, but also feeling the implacable absence of God. We all have been in that pit, haven't we? In that place where a diagnosis turns your life upside down, where the job of your dreams becomes somebody else's, and you realize much too late that your ladder was leaning on the wrong wall of success. We have been in the pit where a loved one's death breaks your heart into a million pieces, where divorce closed the door to a life in which you thought you'd grow old with the person you love. We know that dry and inhuman pit where we struggle to make sense of our world, where bombs turn hundreds of children into amputees, and those with the least protection bear the heavy burden of political expediency. Yes, we have been alone in those moments when prayer sounds like an echo in an empty universe, where God's goodness feels more like religious fantasy than reality, where the precariousness of life appears to be more true than God's grace and providence. The compilers of Genesis, though, had no intention of letting the Israelites or us pin all the world's woes on God alone. They made it clear that human beings have been given the freedom to be co-creators with God in shaping the reality in which we live. In other words, God does not move us like pieces on a chessboard. We have agency. We are free to discern the divine intention for our lives and creation. And because we enjoy God-given freedom, we can also resist God's purposes for ourselves and for humankind. Robinson goes as far as to say that God practices almost limitless restraint to make space for human individuality, agency, freedom, and meaningful existence. So while God's ultimate hope, God's most beautiful dream for you and me and for the human race is one of peace, harmony, solidarity, justice, abundance, compassion, gladness, self-control, and goodness, we are directly responsible for a significant part of the precariousness of life. Much of the harm, pain, and suffering in our history is of our own making. As St. Augustine wrote in the Book of Confessions, each one of us has the puzzling power to will evil and reject good. And we often do that in small and grand scales. We put into motion much of the chaos and catastrophes that befall our planet. Joseph's brothers were profoundly resentful of their younger half-brother. As the late Walter Brueggemann put it, Jacob's 10 sons existed in a triangle of love and jealousy where they felt their father loved them too little and Joseph was loved too much. In their household, Joseph was the golden boy. Marilyn Robinson notes in her book that Joseph is not an unfamiliar type. He's young, bright, self-infatuated, always seeking his father's approval and antagonizing his brothers. His dreams, in which everyone in the family bowed down to him, echoed in his brother's ears as an insufferable grandstanding. And Jacob, formed by the failing of his mother Rebekah, who helped him deceive Isaac, only strained the tenuous bond that was holding his sons together. Rather than maintaining the pecking order and preserving any sense of fairness, Jacob fanned the flames of sibling rivalry by getting Joseph the coat of many colors that Tim Rice and Lloyd Webber immortalized in the musical Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoats. Blinded by their eagerness to quell the inner chaos of anger and bitterness swirling in their hearts and to inflict on their father some of the sadness they lived with, the brothers gave into their worst impulses. They used their God-given freedom for violence. They reduced their brother to someone they would rather write out of history. So they got rid of Joseph, a brother whose presence had become an unwilled agency, a proximity the 10 brothers had neither chosen nor could endure. Joseph's is the longest single story in the Torah. 20 years will go by before he sees his brothers and father again. In Egypt, he will be enslaved, falsely accused of sexual assaults, imprisoned, and he will rise to the pinnacle of political and economic power. 8 times Joseph will weep when famine brings him face to face with the very brothers responsible for a life he never asked for or planned. And when he finally finds the strength to reveal his identity to his family, Joseph chooses forgiveness over revenge, reconciliation over retaliation. His story shows us that while any one of us can add to the precariousness of life, becoming the cause of harm, suffering, division, pain, destruction, and even death, we can also use our freedom to become a source of kindness, compassion, love, peace, forgiveness, and reconciliation in the world. We can make our planet more caring, more just, more tender-hearted. We can keep adding music and laughter, beauty and mercy to the universe so it is even more reflective of the goodness that persists in human nature. We can do everything possible not to stymie God, but to let God's best intentions for life and for this fragile world flourish through us. Marilyn Robinson makes the astounding claim that the stories in Genesis remain, in her words, the world's best hope. She believes that these stories and figures like Joseph, though they may not be historical in any literal sense, can still shape history because you and I and millions of people of faith around the world return to Genesis time and again to be grounded in the hope that we are not alone in this terribly beautiful and unpredictable universe. Though invisible and hidden as God was in Joseph's story, God is still molding our lives, working through us, and at times, in spite of us, to inspire humankind to use our freedom for good rather than evil. Last August, I went to Rio for my aunt's 90th birthday. One of my cousins, who is a cultured despiser of religion, as the German theologian Schleiermacher might say, asked me with a hint of sarcasm how the business of saving souls is doing in the United States. He didn't expect my reply. I told him, without wavering, that the church ministry of saving souls remains as vital now as it ever was. Because in a world where people are more isolated, harsher, angrier, forgetful of grace, and too eager to use their freedom to inflict harm, it is indeed salvific to tell, share, and preach these stories that give you and me the freedom, courage, and the power to use our God-given agency to bring a little more compassion, a little more restraint, a little more forgiveness, a little more hope, a little more reconciliation, a little more goodness into the precariousness of human existence. Yes, friends, we are still in the world-changing business of saving souls. Thanks to the God of Genesis, who, though unseen and veiled, still moves within us, empowering you and me to use our freedom for good, even in those moments when the divine absence feels nearer than God's presence. Amen.